There's a question that has quietly haunted historians, archaeologists, and curious minds for generations. What if Egypt wasn't the beginning? What if, before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before the hieroglyphs carved into stone walls, there was something else? Something older, something that rose, flourished, and then disappeared so completely that we've spent centuries not even knowing to look for it. That idea that a sophisticated civilization existed before the ones we know sits somewhere between serious scholarship and ancient mystery, and depending on who you ask, you'll get very different reactions to it. Some researchers dismiss it outright. Others think we're only beginning to understand how much we've missed. And here's the thing, both positions are more reasonable than you might expect. If you're listening to this as you're drifting off, that's exactly what this is for. So get comfortable. Pull the blanket up. Because what we're going to explore tonight isn't a ghost story or a conspiracy. It's something stranger and more compelling than either of those things. It's the actual documented edge of human memory, the place where the archaeological record gets thin and the questions get enormous. Drop a comment and tell me where you are right now and what time it is. I love seeing those. It's always someone in Stockholm at 2 a.m, someone in Melbourne just waking up, all of us curious at different hours of the same spinning planet. Now, back to the mystery. When most people say civilization before Egypt, they're imagining something dramatic. A lost city beneath the ocean, a vanished empire with monumental architecture, a people with knowledge so advanced it somehow filtered down to later cultures as myth and legend. That version of the story is everywhere. Books, documentaries, late-night internet rabbit holes. And it's seductive because it maps onto something real. This feeling that history as we were taught it has gaps, that the official story is somehow incomplete. Here's what's fascinating, that feeling is correct. But the reality underneath it is even more interesting than the dramatic version. The gaps in early human history are genuine. The incompleteness is real. But the explanation isn't a hidden empire with forgotten technology. It's something quieter, and in some ways more profound. It's the simple, staggering difficulty of being human before writing existed, before permanent cities existed, before the conditions that preserve things for thousands of years were regularly in place. The mystery isn't that a civilization was erased. The mystery is how much complexity can exist without leaving the kind of record we know how to read. So let's be precise about something from the start. Because the word civilization carries a lot of weight and not everyone uses it the same way. Historians generally define civilization by a cluster of features. Dense, settled populations, monumental architecture, social stratification, meaning distinct classes with different roles and power, long-distance trade networks, and some form of record-keeping, whether that's writing, symbols, or structured accounting. By that definition, the oldest civilizations we can clearly identify are Sumer in Mesopotamia and pre-dynastic Egypt, both emerging around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. But that definition is increasingly contested. Because what do you call a society that builds enormous ritual structures, coordinates labor across dozens of communities, maintains shared symbolic systems, and sustains all of this across centuries, but doesn't have writing yet? What do you call people who constructed something like Göbekli Tepe in what is now southern Turkey, more than 11,000 years ago, before agriculture was even widespread? Is that a civilization? Or is it something we don't quite have a word for yet? This is where the real conversation starts. And it's a conversation that archaeology has only recently been equipped to have, because the tools we now have for dating sites, analysing ancient DNA, reading sediment cores, and scanning the ground without digging have transformed what we thought we knew about the deep human past. Things that would have been impossible to detect 30 years ago are now emerging from the earth with startling clarity. And what they're revealing is a world far more complex, far earlier than the textbooks once suggested. Now, a fair warning about what kinds of clues we can and cannot expect. The further back we go, the thinner the evidence gets. Not because nothing was happening, but because preservation is brutally selective. Organic materials rot. Wooden structures collapse and vanish within centuries. Settlements built on floodplains get washed away or buried under meters of sediment. Coastal sites, which would have been prime real estate for any ancient community, have been swallowed by rising sea levels since the end of the last ice age. We're missing enormous amounts of physical evidence simply because of where and how early people lived, not because they left nothing behind. What survives is stone, bones, charcoal from fires, occasional fragments of clay, and increasingly the chemical and genetic traces that modern science can now detect in soil and sediment. That's what we're working with, that's the trail we're going to follow. And it's a slow trail, deliberately slow, because that's actually how the history of this period moves. There was no single moment when someone decided to build civilization. There was no inventor who woke up and sketched out the blueprint for complex society. It was incremental. It was regional. It was driven by forces like climate change, resource pressure, population growth, and something harder to quantify, but just as real, the human need to gather, to make meaning, to build something that outlasts a single lifetime. Some of what we'll cover tonight will feel familiar. Egypt, Sumer, the earliest walls of Jericho. But we're going to approach all of it from a different angle, asking what came before, what was already in motion, what quiet complexity was already unfolding in the centuries and millennia that official history tends to skip over. Because there's a version of the past that doesn't require a lost empire to be extraordinary. There's a version where ordinary people, without metals, without writing, without anything we'd recognize as modern infrastructure, built things and organized themselves and imagined the world in ways that still echo forward to us today. That version of the past is documented, it's evidenced, it's real, and it's genuinely mysterious. So, settle in. We're going back a long way, to a world before Egypt, before Sumer, before anything that shows up in most history books, and we're going to see what was already there. So, when archaeologists say they know something about a culture that existed 10 or 12,000 years ago, what do they actually mean? How do you reconstruct a human life, a human society, from a scatter of stones and a layer of ash? That question matters more than it might seem, because the answer shapes everything else we're going to talk about tonight. It determines what we can say confidently, what we can only suggest cautiously, and what we should be genuinely skeptical of when someone makes a dramatic claim about a vanished world. Let's start with the most basic tool archaeologists have, which is also the most invisible when you look at a photograph of an excavation. It's layers, stratigraphy, the simple principle that older things are generally buried deeper than newer things. When you dig into a site that humans occupied repeatedly over centuries, you're moving through time with every centimetre of soil. A layer of ash might mark a fire. A dense concentration of animal bones might indicate a feast or a kill site. A dark band of organic-rich earth might be where people were throwing their waste. Each layer is a frozen moment, and reading the sequence of them is like reading a very slow, very fragmentary diary written in sediment. But layers lie sometimes. Or rather, they get disturbed. Tree roots push through them. Animals burrow. Floods scour down through multiple periods at once and redeposit material in the wrong order. Later humans dig pits into older layers without leaving any obvious sign that the boundary has been crossed. So a tool that looks like it belongs to one period might have migrated downward over thousands of years, ending up next to material it was never actually associated with. Archaeologists spend enormous energy trying to detect these disturbances, and they don't always succeed, which means uncertainty isn't a failure of method. It's built into the method itself, and the honest ones say so. Then there's radiocarbon dating, Most people have heard of it, but the mechanics are worth slowing down for. All living things absorb carbon from the atmosphere, including a radioactive form called carbon-14. When something dies, whether it's an animal, a tree, or a human, it stops absorbing new carbon, and the carbon-14 it already contains begins to decay at a known rate. Measure how much carbon-14 is left, and you can calculate roughly when the organism died. It's elegant, it's genuinely powerful, but it comes with a calibration range, not a single clean date. When a lab gives you a radiocarbon result, it looks something like this. 9,300 years ago, plus or minus 120 years. That range isn't a mistake. It reflects real uncertainty in the method, partly because atmospheric carbon-14 levels haven't been perfectly constant over time, which means the conversion from radioactive decay to calendar years requires a correction curve that's itself still being refined. Some periods in the past are harder to date precisely because the calibration curve is flat or wiggly in that region, producing wider ranges or multiple possible dates for the same sample. The end of the last ice age is one of those tricky periods. The Younger Dryas, that abrupt cold snap around 12,000 years ago, lands in exactly the kind of time frame where calibration gets complicated. Which is important to remember when people make very precise claims about what was happening right around then. Pollen is another kind of evidence, and a surprisingly rich one. Plants release enormous quantities of pollen, and under the right conditions that pollen settles into lake sediments and bogs and gets preserved for thousands of years. Core a lake bed, and you pull up a record of what was growing in the surrounding landscape at different points in time. You can track the shift from forest to grassland, or the sudden appearance of crop plants that signals agriculture beginning in a region. You can see a dramatic pollen die-off that might indicate a prolonged drought. Pollen cores from lakes in the Middle East, the Sahara and Eastern Europe have been enormously useful in understanding what the climate was actually doing during the periods we care about, and therefore what conditions early humans were living in and adapting to. Bones tell a different kind of story. Animal bones at a site reveal what people were eating, how they were hunting, whether they were managing herds or just taking wild prey opportunistically. Human bones carry evidence of disease, injury, nutrition, and the physical demands of certain kinds of labour. Certain bone deformations show up in people who spent their lives doing repetitive, strenuous work. Isotope analysis of teeth can tell you where someone grew up, which sometimes reveals that they travelled extraordinary distances, or that they came from somewhere entirely different from where they were buried. And then there are the tools. Stone tools in particular, because stone survives almost everything. The shape of a tool, the technique used to make it, the specific type of rock, and where that rock came from, all of this carries information. A flint blade made with a particular knapping technique is a signature, almost like a regional accent. Finding that same technique at sites hundreds of miles apart suggests contact, trade, shared knowledge. And changes in tool technology over time map onto changes in how people were living, what they were hunting, how much they were moving. DNA has become the newest, and in some ways most astonishing member of this evidence family. Ancient DNA extracted from bones and teeth has completely rewritten parts of early human history in just the last 15 years. We now know things about population movements, interbreeding events, and genetic diversity in prehistory that would have been literally unimaginable to archaeologists working in the 1990s. The Denisovans, an entire branch of the human family, were discovered not through fossils but through genetic analysis of a single-finger bone. We can now trace the migrations of early farmers out of Anatolia, watch them spreading across Europe, detect when they mixed with the hunter-gatherer populations who were already there. But DNA has limits too. It preserves best in cold, dry conditions. It degrades in tropical environments, is subject to contamination at the extraction stage, and what we can reconstruct is always a sample, always partial, always shaped by which individuals happen to be buried in places and conditions that allowed preservation. We're not getting a complete genetic census of ancient populations. We're getting glimpses, and the picture we construct from those glimpses may shift as more data comes in. All of this matters because of what it means for the difference between sensational claims and cautious inference. There's a version of early history you'll encounter in certain books and documentaries that presents the evidence as far more definitive than it is. A submerged structure off the coast of somewhere becomes definitive proof of an advanced civilization. A single anomalous artifact becomes evidence of lost knowledge. A similarity between two distant architectural traditions becomes confirmation of a shared source. These claims tend to skip over exactly the kinds of uncertainty we've been describing. The disturbed layers, the calibration ranges, the sampling limits, the alternative explanations that are often simpler and better supported. Cautious inference works differently. It says, here is what we found, here is the range of dates it could represent, here are the possible explanations, and here is the one that currently fits the most evidence, while contradicting the least. It leaves room for the picture to change as new data arrives. And crucially, it distinguishes between things we know, things we infer with reasonable confidence, and things that are genuinely open. That distinction is not a weakness, it's what makes the knowledge trustworthy. Which brings us to how this conversation is going to handle these questions as we go forward. When we talk about Göbekli Tepe, we're going to be honest that we don't know who built it or exactly what it was for, but we can say quite a lot about when it was built and how much labour and coordination it required. When we talk about the Black Sea flood hypothesis, we're going to acknowledge that it's a serious scientific proposal while also noting where the evidence is genuinely contested. When we encounter something that looks mysterious, we're going to try to understand why it looks that way before concluding that it actually is. The goal isn't to deflate the wonder, the goal is to protect it. Because real complexity, real human ingenuity, operating at the edge of what we can detect, is more remarkable than a mystery that dissolves under scrutiny. There's something almost moving about the fact that we can know anything at all about people who lived 12,000 years ago, who never wrote their names down, who built things in wood and bone and memory that are almost entirely gone. The traces they left are faint and ambiguous, and subject to ongoing debate, and yet here we are, pulling meaning out of pollen and stone and the fading signatures of carbon, following a trail that gets thinner the further back it goes until it almost disappears. But doesn't quite. That's where we're headed, into the thin places in the record, where the questions are bigger than the answers and where the silence itself is full of information, if you know how to listen to it. If you follow that thinning trail back to the very edge of the last ice age, the world you arrive in is both familiar and utterly alien. Sea level is lower, a lot lower, more than 100 meters below what you're used to. So the map in your head, the one with recognizable coastlines, is wrong. The British Isles are not islands. They're the western hills of a broad plain we now call Doggerland, stretching between what is now England and continental Europe, crossed by rivers that no longer exist, feeding into a North Sea that hasn't filled in yet. The Persian Gulf is mostly dry land, a great low basin where rivers from the Tigris, Euphrates, and Karun wander and braid before finally reaching a much more distant shoreline. Southeast Asia is a single huge peninsula. The islands of Indonesia are connected to each other and to the mainland in a drowned landmass called Sunda. Japan is closer to the continent. The Black Sea is a smaller, more enclosed lake. The Mediterranean's outline is different. What you think of as the coast is often tens of kilometers inland from where the water actually is. This matters because human beings, then as now, have a habit of clustering near shorelines. Rivers and coasts are where fresh water, food and easy travel come together. They are natural highways and natural supermarkets. So when you picture the world before cities, it's tempting to imagine empty landscapes with scattered bands of people wandering through them. But the places where many of those people actually lived, worked and gathered may now be underwater. If there were early centres of population density, seasonal meeting places, or even something like proto-towns during the late Ice Age and the warming that followed, a significant fraction of them could be sitting today on continental shelves, buried under meters of sediment, unreachable or barely sampled. The archaeological record we have is biased toward what stayed above the rising seas, not necessarily toward where the most interesting things were happening. Above those vanished shorelines, the climate is changing fast. Ice sheets are retreating, glaciers are melting, huge pulses of cold freshwater are pouring into the oceans, jostling the climate system, creating swings like the Younger Dryas. In some years, a valley might look lush and promising, and then a century later it's drier, harsher, or buried under advancing forest. People are living inside a moving target, and yet, for all that instability, these late Ice Age hunter-gatherers are not just huddling in caves waiting for agriculture to be invented. Their lives are structured, patterned, socially complex. One of the most important patterns is seasonal aggregation. For much of the year, people may live in small, mobile bands, dozens of individuals following migrating herds, ripening plants, fish runs. But at certain times when conditions allow, those bands come together. A salmon run that clogs a river for a few weeks, a migration crossing that funnels animals through a narrow pass, a particular plant that fruits in huge quantities all at once. These are the calendar events that make larger gatherings possible. At these aggregation sites, hundreds of people might camp in the same general area for weeks or months. They trade partners, share news, arrange marriages, settle disputes, teach skills, sing the old stories, and probably invent new ones. They exchange more than gossip. They move objects, ideas, and obligations across distances that would surprise most people today. We know this because the stone and bone remember. In Upper Paleolithic Europe, high-quality flint from one quarry shows up hundreds of kilometers away, in places where that stone does not occur naturally. In the Levant, obsidian from specific volcanic sources appears at sites many days' walk from any volcano. Marine shells travel inland, far from any coast. Decorative styles show up in distant regions, slightly altered, like accents shifting along a chain of speakers. None of this requires cities. It does require networks, people who know where they can go, who they can stay with, what kind of gifts are expected, which paths are safe. It requires memory stretched over landscapes and stories that act as maps. Out of this kind of world, something else begins to appear: early monumentality. Before there are cities, there are places that people return to, again and again, for reasons that go beyond immediate survival. Sometimes these are natural features: a striking rock outcrop, a cave with unusual acoustics, a solitary hill visible for miles. Over time, people start to mark these places: a ring of stones, a cleared area, a wooden structure that rots and is rebuilt, a mound of earth that grows larger with every generation that adds to it. Monuments, in this sense, are not just big things. They are social technologies. They fix memory to the landscape. They tell you, here is where your ancestors did something important. Here is where the rituals happen. Here is where you bring the dead, or the offerings, or the stories. They create predictable focal points in an unpredictable world. You can think of them as the hardware that supports more complex software. Shared myths, seasonal calendars, exchange systems, maybe even forms of leadership that only exist when enough people are gathered in one place. A person who is just another hunter back at the winter camp might, on that special hill in late summer, become the keeper of the rituals, the one who knows the right sequence of songs. These monuments can be surprisingly old. Long before Göbekli Tepe, we see large earthworks and possible ritual structures associated with late Paleolithic groups. But they're often low, eroded, indistinct, or built of wood and soil rather than carved stone. Time is not kind to subtlety. A sprawling wooden enclosure that took hundreds of people to build might leave almost nothing that jumps out to the modern eye. A later stone temple, on the other hand, keeps its shape. This is one reason early centres may leave such faint traces compared to later cities. You can have a place that draws people from a wide radius, that anchors trade and ritual without permanent dense settlement. If most of the year everyone is somewhere else, their houses can be light, temporary, burned or abandoned and rebuilt elsewhere. The heavy investment is in the shared place, not in individual dwellings. And when your main construction materials are earth, wood, brush and bone, a few thousand years of wind and rain, ploughing and rooting will do a lot of editing. There's another shift happening in the background that makes more sustained building projects possible. The climate is calming down. After the wild swings of the late glacial period, the early Holocene ushers in a span of relative stability. Temperatures are warmer, but more importantly, they are predictable enough, year to year, that people can begin to rely on certain patterns. Rainfall is still variable, but not in the same violently erratic way. Forests expand and settle in. Grasslands establish themselves. Animal populations follow more regular cycles. All of this reduces risk. And when risk drops, horizons lengthen. If you have a reasonable expectation that this valley will still be habitable 30 years from now, you can justify putting serious labour into reshaping it. You can terrace a hillside, dig a substantial well, build something that you intend your grandchildren to see. If the seasonal gatherings at a particular place are no longer constantly threatened by abrupt climate reversals, people can invest more in structures that expect return visitors again and again. Climate stability acts like a permission slip for architecture and infrastructure. It doesn't force people to settle down or build big things, but it makes the decision to do so less reckless. The cost-benefit calculation shifts. Some groups in this newly predictable world begin experimenting with tending wild plants, with corralling animals rather than just hunting them, with making certain sites more permanent. Those experiments don't yet look like cities. They look like villages, seasonal hamlets, ceremonial centres. They look like halfway points between a world of movement and a world of walls. And on a hill in southeastern Anatolia, in that new, slightly calmer climate, a group of hunter-gatherers decided to try something that still doesn't fit neatly into our categories at all. On that hill, which we now call Göbekli Tepe, the experiment begins with stone. Not with houses, not with fields, with pillars. Imagine walking up toward the crest in the pre-dawn half-light. Before you see any details, you'd see the outline of circles and ovals scooped into the slope, their rims made of low stone walls. Inside each of those enclosures rising out of the bedrock itself are tall, T-shaped pillars of limestone. Some stand 5 or 6 meters high. They're not rough boulders hauled into place and left as is. They've been carved, shaped, their edges sharpened into clear geometric shoulders. And on the faces of many of them, someone has taken the time to carve life into the stone. Snakes slither along the sides. Foxes stretch their bodies in mid-stride. Wild boar, birds, big cats, scorpions. Sometimes the animals almost overlap, like a crowded memory. Some images are deeply incised, others more shallow, like later additions. On a few pillars you can make out stylized belts, hands folded in front, fingers etched delicately down the side. The whole T-shape suddenly reads less like an abstract form and more like a highly stylized body, a presence. The pillars don't stand randomly. In the most famous enclosures, a ring of smaller T-shapes encircles 2 much larger ones in the centre, like a stone audience facing a stone pair. Beneath the topsoil, more circles lie hidden, stacked in layers. As older enclosures were deliberately filled in with rubble and animal bones, newer ones were carved nearby, slightly different in style. This is architecture as ritual focus. There are no hearths tucked against the walls, no storage silos for grain. No trash layers thick with domestic debris the way you see at later villages. You don't find streets or everyday workshops. What you do find is careful arrangement of space, repeated patterns in how the enclosures are laid out, and endless attention lavished on surfaces nobody strictly needed to decorate. Göbekli Tepe is, as far as we can tell, a place built to gather around, not a place built to live in. That alone would make it remarkable. But then comes the dating. When archaeologists first started working there in the 1990s, they assumed, reasonably enough, that such an elaborate stone complex had to belong to a farming society. Maybe something like a cousin of early Mesopotamian temples. Then the radiocarbon dates came back. The deepest, oldest levels of Göbekli Tepe cluster around 9,600 to 8,800 BCE. The younger layers, with smaller, less massive pillars, continue into the mid-8000s BCE, and probably a bit beyond, even if you fuzz those dates by a few centuries either way. The site is more than 6,000 years older than the Pyramid Age in Egypt. It's older than Stonehenge by almost as much time as separates Stonehenge from us. In human terms, if you lined up every pharaoh of Egypt, from Narmer to Cleopatra, and made them all stand shoulder to shoulder, you still wouldn't bridge the span between Göbekli Tepe's first monuments and the building of the Great Pyramid. What makes it stranger is the lifestyle of its builders. The animal bones at the site are overwhelmingly from wild species: gazelle, wild cattle, wild ass, aurochs. The plant remains point to gathering and processing of wild grasses and other foraged foods. There is some debate about the earliest hints of plant management in the region, but at Göbekli Tepe's height, the people using it look, by most measures, like sophisticated hunter-gatherers rather than full-scale farmers. In other words, this is monumental stone architecture without cities. Ornate, labour-intensive construction, created by people who, as far as we can tell, didn't yet live in permanent, dense settlements, or rely on domesticated herds and crops as their main food source. So how does something like this happen? One line of thinking sees Göbekli Tepe as a pilgrimage centre, a hilltop that drew in bands from a wide radius at certain times of year, perhaps keyed to animal migrations or seasonal ripening of specific plants. Different groups might have owned different enclosures or different pillars in the sense of ancestral ties or ritual responsibilities. People would converge, camp around the slopes, and move through the circles in processions of some kind, reenacting stories we no longer know. Another view emphasizes coalition building, in a world where separate bands increasingly bump into each other along the same river valleys and pastures. A shared ritual centre can act like political glue. You show up. You participate in ceremonies that remind everyone of deeper connections. You renew alliances, exchange marriage partners, settle long-running arguments. The towering stones and carved animals are not just decoration. They're stage sets for social negotiation. Feasting fits easily into both pictures. Archaeologists have found large numbers of animal bones with cut marks, and evidence of big stone vessels that may have been used to brew something like beer from wild cereals. Not casual dinners, but concentrated episodes of slaughter and consumption, the kind of thing that leaves a mark in the soil. These gatherings could have been moments when labour was pooled, walls repaired, new pillars raised. You eat and drink together, and afterward you haul stone together. When you think of it that way, Göbekli Tepe looks less like an anomaly and more like an amplification of patterns already present in mobile societies: seasonal aggregation, shared rituals, obligation, and reciprocity. The difference is scale and material. Instead of a circle of posts and brush, a ring of carved stone that can outlast generations. Then comes the part that really bothers people. Göbekli Tepe wasn't destroyed by an obvious catastrophe. It wasn't knocked down by an invading army. Over many centuries, its own builders, or their descendants, seem to have systematically buried parts of it. Enclosures were filled to the brim with rubble, broken stone and bones, sometimes including fragments of the very pillars that once stood proudly upright. Why? One hypothesis is simple replacement. Ritual spaces get retired and entombed when they're considered used up or too saturated with power or memory. A new, fresher enclosure is built nearby. Burial in this sense isn't about hiding or rejecting the site. It's a way of preserving and honouring it, like sealing an old temple rather than letting it crumble piece by piece. Another possibility is more pragmatic. The act of backfilling may have helped stabilise the structures over time, or protected them from weathering in a landscape where people were still active but shifting their focus elsewhere. What reads to us as abandonment might have been, in their terms, careful closure. Some have speculated about darker reasons: social change, conflict, some ideological shift that made the old symbols dangerous. But here the evidence thins quickly. We don't have written accounts. We don't have clear signs of violent destruction. We have filled circles and a sequence of construction and decommissioning that is orderly enough to suggest intention and ambiguous enough to support multiple stories. And that brings us to what Göbekli Tepe does and does not tell us about lost civilizations. It tells us that hunter-gatherers, or people right on the cusp of tending plants and animals, were capable of organising large-scale building projects thousands of years earlier than most textbooks used to emphasise. It tells us that symbolically charged monuments can precede full-blown agriculture and cities, not just follow from them. Temples, or at least ritual centres, can come before towns. It suggests that social complexity, hierarchies of knowledge, specialised roles, long-distance coordination can exist in forms that don't leave behind palaces, writing, or neatly gridded streets. It underlines how shaky the old equation, no pottery, no ploughs, no city walls, therefore simple people, really is. What it does not prove is the existence of some forgotten, globally advanced civilization wiped from the map before Egypt, leaving only this hilltop as a stray fingerprint. There are no signs here of metalworking, of lost sciences, of technological leaps centuries ahead of their time. There are finely made stone tools, complex rituals, and an impressive command of quarrying and construction using muscle, rope, and ingenuity. Göbekli Tepe is mysterious, but it's a human mystery, on a human scale. If anything, it points us away from the idea of a single vanished mother civilization, and towards something more subtle, a patchwork of regional networks, each experimenting in their own way with monuments, rituals, and ways of tying groups together. Göbekli Tepe may be the most spectacular surviving example from its time, but it's unlikely to have been completely alone. It's simply the part of the tapestry that the erosion of time happened to spare. And if one hilltop in southeastern Anatolia can hold this much story in its buried rings of stone, it's natural to wonder what else might be waiting on other hills in other valleys, on plains that are now sea floor. To look for answers, you don't have to travel far. Just over the horizon from Göbekli Tepe, scattered across the same highlands, other sites begin to appear. Smaller, quieter, more domestic. Places where people not only gathered to carve pillars, but also began to stay. If Göbekli Tepe is the loudest hill in the landscape, the surrounding region is a low murmur that gradually swells into a chorus. Within a few days' walk of the site, archaeologists have identified other hills with carved stones and circular enclosures. Places like Karahan Tepe, Seyfa Tepe, Hamzan Tepe, Seybirch. Many of them share the same basic grammar: T-shaped pillars, animal reliefs, paved floors, stone benches. Not as massive, not as fully excavated, but clearly speaking a related architectural language. It begins to look less like a one-off marvel and more like a regional style. At some sites, the pillars are slimmer or the animal carvings favour different species. A particular valley might be into snakes and birds. Another prefers wild cattle and felines. One hilltop emphasises deep, almost three-dimensional sculptures. Another sticks to shallow, elegant outlines. The differences feel a bit like dialects, local flavours layered on top of a shared tradition. And these ritual spaces don't stand in isolation. Scattered between and around them are humbler traces, low stone foundations, hearths, refuse pits, storage features, the beginnings of something more settled. By the later levels of Göbekli Tepe's use, and at neighbouring sites in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, you can see people experimenting with staying put for longer stretches. Not quite permanent towns yet, but not purely mobile bands either. Archaeologists call this a mixed economy. Hunting and gathering still matter, but people are also starting to invest in particular patches of land. You see the shift most clearly in the plants. Alongside wild grains, there are signs that some cereals are changing. The seeds get a little plumper. The way they attach to the stalk becomes less well suited to shattering in the wind, and more convenient for human harvest. These are tiny incremental differences, visible only under careful analysis, but they add up to the earliest steps toward domesticated wheat and barley. Animals tell a similar story. In the earliest layers, people are taking wild gazelle, wild cattle, wild pigs in proportions that look like opportunistic hunting. A few centuries later, in nearby sites like Sheoni and others along the upper Tigris, the pattern starts to tilt. More young males culled, more consistent age profiles, subtle changes in bone size. It suggests some herds are no longer purely wild. They're being managed at least part of the year. What emerges in this broader Anatolian and northern Mesopotamian landscape is not a clean break. No moment where one group wakes up as hunter-gatherers and the next morning they're farmers. Instead, you see people layering new strategies onto old ones. You can imagine a year that unfolds like this, winter and early spring spent in more permanent base camps, near good water and storage facilities, drawing on cached grain and dried meat, late spring and summer ranging farther out to hunt, gather, and perhaps tend stands of wild cereals or check on half-tamed herds, then a return to particular ritual centres at set times for feasting, marriage exchanges, and the slow, ongoing work of rewriting the stones. Those base camps are where we start to see the skeleton of early village life. At sites slightly later in time than Göbekli Tepe's earliest levels, rectangular buildings appear alongside circular ones. Walls are built and rebuilt on the same footprints. Floors are plastered and replastered, sometimes with care taken to smooth and whiten them. There are dedicated storage bins, pits lined with stone or plaster to keep grain dry and safe from rodents. Communal architecture doesn't disappear when houses appear. It changes form. In places like Nevali Chori, now submerged under a dam reservoir but well studied before the waters rose, a clearly special building stands out from the domestic clusters. It has larger, more finely worked pillars with hands and belts similar to those at Göbekli Tepe, set inside a rectangular room. The scale is smaller, tucked into a settlement rather than crowning a hill, but the idea is familiar: a shared space, elaborately built, distinct from everyday living quarters. This pattern hints at social organisation that is already layered. There are household spaces where daily life unfolds, and there are community spaces where something else happens: rituals, meetings, decisions, initiations. You don't yet see palaces or stark differences in house size that would scream elite versus commoner, but you do see the architecture of coordination. Storage is a quiet but powerful clue in this picture. When food can be kept for months or even years, it changes the politics of a community. Someone has to decide where storage goes, who builds and maintains it, who guards it, who has the right to open it and under what conditions. Communal silos suggest communal rules. They hint at shared calendars, agreed upon moments of distribution, maybe even early forms of tribute or tithes. In this Anatolian network, you can trace those hints not just in stone, but in what moves between sites. Obsidian from central Anatolia shows up hundreds of kilometres away. shells from the Mediterranean coast appear inland. Certain types of finely made stone tools or characteristic ornamental objects like specific bead styles are found across wide areas. No single settlement is large enough to be driving everything. No empire is directing traffic. Yet the same materials and motifs ripple across the whole region. Ideas are travelling the same way things do along paths of trade, kinship, and seasonal movement. Imagine bands whose home territories partly overlap. In one valley, people have worked out a particularly efficient way to knap a new kind of blade. In another, someone has figured out how to line a pit with plaster so it holds grain better. When people meet at a ritual hilltop or at the margin of a hunting ground, they don't just swap meat for obsidian, they swap techniques, stories, perhaps even songs that encode instructions. Marriages are one of the most reliable conduits in this web. Genetic studies of later Neolithic populations suggest that even in small communities, there was a steady trickle of spouses coming from outside the immediate group. That pattern probably began earlier. A woman or man leaving their birth group to join another doesn't just bring their body, they bring memories of how things are done elsewhere. How to build a certain wall, how to prepare a certain dish, how to perform a certain ceremony. Over generations, this kind of exchange can knit together a culturally coherent region. Without a capital city, without armies, without an official priesthood. From a distance of 10 or 12,000 years, though, that coherence can easily fragment in our eyes. Changes that might have felt gradual to the people living through them can look abrupt in the archaeological record. A shift in house shape, a new favoured material, a reorganisation of where ritual buildings sit in relation to homes. If our excavations only capture scattered samples, these can appear as sudden breaks. A hilltop covered in T-pillars is used for centuries, then carefully backfilled. Nearby, a village with a modest special building flourishes. A few hundred years later, another settlement a valley away seems to take the lead in monument building. From trench to trench, it can resemble rise and fall, appearance and disappearance. But if you zoom out, what you see is less a vanishing act and more a relay. Ritual practices migrate from big, isolated centres into the hearts of villages. Monumentality shifts from freestanding circles to built-in features inside rectangular halls. The focus of community life moves downhill, closer to fields and herds, as subsistence becomes more anchored in managed landscapes. To a later observer, it might feel as if the world of Göbekli Tepe has ended, replaced by something more domestic, more agricultural. In reality, many of the same threads are still there, just woven into a different pattern. This is one of the reasons lost civilizations can be so tempting. When we see a style or a site type stop abruptly in one place, and another, different pattern begins somewhere else, our minds reach for clean narratives, a people who vanished, another who appeared. But in Anatolia's early Neolithic, the story seems to be one of continuity through transformation. Communities link to communities, hills to valleys, circles of stone to clusters of houses. The network shifts shape, but the network persists. And that network doesn't stop at the Anatolian plateau. If you keep following those threads of architecture, of storage and surplus, of increasingly tight domestic clusters, they lead you towards something new. The first places where people truly pack themselves in, wall to wall, roof to roof. Follow those threads far enough, and they converge on a flat-topped mound in central Anatolia, on the Konya plain. From a distance, Çatalhöyük looks like so many other tells in the Near East, just a low, dusty rise in an otherwise open landscape. Up close, in the excavated squares and profiles, it turns into something stranger. Layer upon layer of mud brick houses, stacked so tightly that from above they resemble the cells of a honeycomb. No streets in the way we think of them, no open plazas, just blocks of rooms pressed against one another, sharing walls, sharing heat, sharing risk. If Göbekli Tepe and its cousins were like regional hilltop cathedrals, Çatalhöyük feels more like an experiment in living shoulder to shoulder. It has some of the things we associate with cities, a population that at its peak may have numbered in the low thousands, a long span of occupation, centuries of continuous rebuilding, specialized craft activities, obsidian knapping, plaster production, bead making, long-distance trade bringing in shiny black glass from Cappadocia, shells from distant coasts, pigments from particular mineral sources, but in other ways it refuses to behave like the later cities we know. There are no palaces, no monumental temples rising above the rooftops, no defensive walls encircling the settlement in a neat ring, no obvious central market square where all traffic converges. If there was a ruling class, it left almost no architectural fingerprint. Instead, Çatalhöyük is organized as a dense patchwork of near-identical house blocks. Each dwelling is built right up against its neighbours. People don't walk in through doors at ground level. They climb ladders and enter from the roof. Daily life unfolds in a main room with a hearth, platforms for sleeping and working, storage bins tucked into corners and under floors. When a house ages or becomes unstable, they often knock it down to the foundations and build again on the same footprint, slightly higher. Over time, that cycle creates a vertical archive of family life, floor upon floor of plaster, smoothed, painted, worn and replastered, hearths that shift a little, then settle back into the same corner, storage pits dug, used, filled and forgotten beneath new surfaces. It's as if each household is inscribing its own microhistory in mud and lime. Inside those houses, the walls are not bare. Some rooms are covered with elaborate plaster reliefs, animal figures emerging in low rounded shapes, bulls' heads and horns built out from the surface, geometric patterns painted in red and white. There are hunting scenes where human figures and animals intertwine, hands raised, bodies in motion. In a few places there are arrangements of handprints, repeated motifs that might have carried meanings now opaque to us. Not every room is decorated this way. Even within a single building, some spaces are plain and utilitarian, others dense with imagery. That uneven distribution has led some researchers to suggest that certain rooms or certain houses had special roles, maybe as places for rituals, lineage gatherings, or the display of household prestige. Burials add another layer of meaning to these spaces. At Çatalhöyük, the dead are not sent to a separate cemetery. They are placed beneath the floors of the living bodies, often flexed or tightly wrapped, are interred under platforms where people sleep and work. Over years and decades, a single family room might accumulate multiple burials, stacked in carefully organized clusters. Children and infants are especially common, but adults appear too, sometimes with ornaments or tools. In some cases, skulls are later removed from these graves and treated separately. A few are plastered and painted or reburied with care, echoing practices seen at other Neolithic sites in the Levant. It suggests an ancestral presence woven directly into domestic space. The house is not just a shelter, it is a tomb, a shrine, a node in a network of remembered kin. When archaeologists map the distribution of burials, wall art, horn installations, and particular objects across the settlement, subtle neighbourhood patterns emerge. Certain clusters of houses share similar decorative styles. In one area, bull horns and hunting scenes dominate. In another, there are more abstract motifs, or emphasis on certain animals. Some house blocks have more burials beneath them, or burials with richer grave goods. Others are comparatively plain. It creates a patchwork of micro-communities within the greater mass, each with its own flavour and history. From this, you start to get a sense of how authority might have worked here. Instead of a single, obvious top-down hierarchy, Çatalhöyük looks more like a mosaic of powerful households and kin groups. Some houses are slightly larger, or more richly decorated, or more centrally placed, but the differences are muted. The range of house sizes is relatively narrow. There are no obvious mansions towering over humble huts. This has fueled a long-running debate. Was Çatalhöyük an unusually egalitarian mega-village, where status differences existed but were kept relatively flat, managed through household competition rather than centralized chiefs? Or are we simply missing the clearest signals of inequality, signals that might have been expressed in things that don't preserve well, like textiles, perishable offerings, or the subtle choreography of who was allowed where and when? Some researchers point to the distribution of exotic goods and elaborate wall art, noting that a limited number of houses seem to host more of the special stuff. Others highlight isotopic studies of bones that show broadly similar diets across the population, suggesting that, at least in terms of food, people were not sharply divided into haves and have-nots. Leadership may have been situational, elders, ritual specialists, or skilled craftspeople gaining influence in particular contexts, without crystallizing into a permanent ruling class with its own distinct architecture. If that's true, then Çatalhöyük is city-like in scale, but village-like in its social fabric. And as with any dense cluster of humans, the arrangement came with costs. Packing thousands of people into tightly packed mud-brick houses, without streets or sewers, creates ideal conditions for certain kinds of problems. Fire is an obvious one. Disease is another. Waste management in a roof entry, wall-to-wall settlement is not simple. Refuse areas and middens appear around the edges of the mound, but the risk of contamination, parasites and crowd-borne illnesses would have been high. Resource strain is also part of the equation. The surrounding landscape had to support not just the people of Çatalhöyük, but their herds and fields. Over time, as the settlement grew and persisted, nearby wood sources would have been cut for fuel and construction. Fields would need to be worked, manured, rotated, or moved. The balance between the town and its hinterland could easily become precarious. Archaeological evidence suggests that Çatalhöyük does not end with a single dramatic catastrophe. There is no clear destruction layer of ash and rubble that shouts invasion or volcanic doom. Instead, there are hints of gradual thinning. Parts of the mound fall out of use. New houses are built less densely. Activity shifts towards smaller satellite settlements in the surrounding plain. Environmental data point to changing local conditions, shifts in water availability, erosion, perhaps salinization of fields. Skeletal evidence hints at health stresses that may have accumulated over generations, signs of infections, nutritional deficiencies, repetitive strain from labor. It's easy to imagine a slow recalibration, families deciding that life on the crowded mound is no longer worth the smell, the sickness, the friction with neighbours. Younger generations drifting outward to start new, smaller villages where there is more space, more fresh air, more flexibility. The central mega-settlement doesn't vanish overnight. It frays, decentralizes, dissolves into a more distributed pattern of habitation. Çatalhöyük, in this view, is not a lost civilization that disappeared without trace. It's a phase, a particular way of organizing people and houses and rituals that gradually gives way to others. Its residents or their descendants do not step off the stage of history. They simply move into a different arrangement, smaller towns, scattered farmsteads, new regional centres. The wall art changes style, the burial customs shift. The tell itself stops growing from our perspective, the mound ends. From theirs, life goes on, just not in quite the same crowded, roof-to-roof way. This is why Çatalhöyük complicates the idea of sudden vanishing. When we see a dense, complex settlement that rises and then slowly unwinds, it reminds us that disappearance in the archaeological record often means transformation rather than extinction. A mega-village can end because it did what it needed to do and then became uncomfortable or inefficient or vulnerable. People respond not with a dramatic last stand, but with a series of quiet choices. To build the next house a little farther away, to align with a different neighbourhood, to invest their labour in a new place where their children might thrive. From the vantage point of later cities, with their walls and gates and written laws, Çatalhöyük looks like an early draft, dense, vibrant, messy, and ultimately unsustainable in that exact form. But the experiment leaves behind ideas about how to live close together, how to tie households into neighbourhoods, how to embed ancestors into daily space, that echo in later urban worlds. And if a city can thin out without truly dying, if its people can slip into smaller settlements and carry their traditions elsewhere, then other apparent disappearances in the ancient Near East begin to look different too. Which brings us to another early experiment in dense living, one that wrapped itself in stone walls and watched the desert from a spring-fed oasis, Jericho. Jericho begins not with a king but with water. Long before it became a byword for trumpets and crumbling ramparts, it was simply a place where springs rose from the edge of the Jordan Valley, feeding a patch of green in an otherwise harsh landscape. That water drew people in, again and again, for thousands of years. By the time we first see something like a town here, around 9000 BCE, the tell is already a layered archive of earlier camps and hamlets. And then, very early in that story, something odd appears. On the western edge of the Neolithic settlement, archaeologists uncovered a massive stone wall, several meters thick, wrapping around at least part of the community. Just inside that wall sat a circular stone tower, more than 8 meters high in its earliest preserved phase, with an internal staircase spiralling up from a deep, stone-lined pit. For the time period, it is astonishing. This is not a loose fence or a few token stones. It is a serious piece of engineering, stones quarried, transported, stacked carefully without mortar. A tower whose base cuts deeply into the older deposits, suggesting deliberate planning and a willingness to move a lot of earth. What does it mean for a small, pre-metal, pre-writing village to invest that much labour in a single structure? The immediate temptation is to read it like later history. Walls mean enemies, towers mean defence. But at Jericho's early date, the picture is murkier. There is no clear archaeological evidence for organised war on a scale that would demand a full fortification ring. The wall does not bristle with bastions, the tower's internal staircase faces inward, not outward towards some imagined attacker. So other interpretations come into play. One suggestion is flood control. The settlement sits near the foot of slopes that would have channeled seasonal runoff. A broad stone wall at the base might have acted as a dam or retaining barrier, catching debris and diverting water away from the fragile mud brick houses behind it. From this angle, the earliest city wall looks less like a military structure and more like large-scale infrastructure. The tower, too, might connect to the landscape. Some researchers have pointed out that, at certain times of year, the setting sun would align with the stairs and upper platform, possibly turning it into a kind of seasonal marker, a place where sky, horizon, and human construction intersect. In that reading, you're not looking at a watchtower, but at a built axis between community, cycle of the year, and surrounding hills. There's also the simpler, more human possibility, status and display. A huge tower looming over a cluster of relatively low houses sends a message, even if that message is never written down. It says, we can do this. We can organise enough people, gather enough stone, feed enough workers to raise something that will outlast us. In societies without written charters or stone inscriptions, monumentality itself can be the inscription. The tower writes the community into the landscape. And then there is the idea of the wall and tower as a communal project. Even if there was no single king of Jericho at this time, the work would still have required coordination, decisions about where to build, when to build, how to distribute labour, who brings food and water to the builders, who is excused from other tasks. In a world of extended families and lineages, that kind of project can become a focus of shared identity. You might imagine it as a ritual of making and remaking the group. Children growing up with stories about how their parents or grandparents helped lift those stones. Seasonal gatherings where work on the wall is paired with feasting, with marriages arranged, with disputes settled. The structure then is not just a passive barrier, it's a memory machine, an anchor for narratives about who we are and what we can do together. Jericho matters here because it shows that monumental construction can emerge long before the trappings of kingship we tend to look for. There are no royal tombs from this phase, no carved statues of rulers, no elevated palace platforms. The houses inside the wall are relatively modest. They hint at household-level differences, but not sharp divides between palaces and huts. Yet the collective labour poured into the tower and wall is on a scale we usually associate with states. This suggests that you don't need crowns, standing armies and tax ledgers to pull off big building projects. You need something more basic, dense social networks, shared beliefs and mechanisms, formal or informal, for coordinating effort. Sometimes that mechanism might be fear, real or implied. A wall can crystallize concerns about raiders, predators, or floods into one visible object. Sometimes it might be hope or obligation to ancestors, or expectations of divine favor. More often than not, it is probably all of those at once, braided into stories that no longer survive. What does survive at Jericho is continuity. The earliest tower and wall belong to one phase. Later levels show rebuilding, modification, new walls erected, old ones patched or cut through. The exact pattern is complex, but one thing is clear: the settlement does not rise, build its monument, and then vanish overnight under some catastrophic conquest. Instead, the city in embryo persists. Mud brick houses are demolished and rebuilt. Burial customs shift. The outlines of walls creep, thicken, thin. There are episodes of destruction, yes, collapsed structures, signs of burning, but they sit within a larger story of persistence and adaptation. This undercuts the neat narrative in which ancient towns are born, flourish, and collapse in a single dramatic stroke. At Jericho, as at Catalhoyuk, people stay put, adjust, rework their space. The tower may fall out of use or be swallowed by new construction. The wall might be abandoned, then later segments reused. To an archaeologist reading the stratigraphy, these are layers. To the people living through them, they are simply life, rebuilding after a flood, shifting house plots, negotiating with neighbouring groups. Seen against the broader Near Eastern backdrop, Jericho's early walls and tower look less like an isolated marvel and more like one node in a regional shift. Across the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia, we start to see communities experimenting with larger-scale projects, shared enclosures, community buildings, elaborate burial grounds. Some invest in stone, others in earthworks, others in decorated houses or paved courtyards. Each choice reveals a different way of binding people to place. In Anatolia, that impulse produces roof-entry mega-villages like Çatalhöyük. In southeastern Turkey, it raises circles of carved pillars at Göbekli Tepe and its cousins. In the Jordan Valley, it becomes a stone tower and wall at an oasis town. All of them point in the same general direction. Long before cities with kings and cuneiform, people were already learning how to pool labour for projects bigger than any single household. They were already rehearsing the skills that later states would formalise: planning, surplus management, long-term maintenance, symbolic display. Jericho's earliest walls in this sense are not just stones around a village. They are an early line in a much longer story, a story that will eventually include levees along the Tigris and Euphrates, canal systems, ziggurats, and flood myths about waters that rise higher than any wall. And that brings us to another piece of the puzzle, the shifting waterlines themselves, and the worlds that quite literally sank beneath them. When people first started stacking stones at Jericho, the shape of the world's shorelines was not what we see on a map today. For tens of thousands of years before that, enormous ice sheets had locked up water at the poles and on high mountains. Sea levels were lower in some places by more than 100 metres. Coastlines stretched farther out. Continental shelves we now think of as the ocean floor were dry land, cut by rivers, dotted with lakes, shaped by wind and weather in the open air. Then, slowly and unevenly, the ice began to melt. From about 20,000 years ago onward, oceans rose. Not in a single Hollywood-style wall of water, but in pulses and plateaus. Ice sheets collapsed, meltwater lakes drained, glaciers retreated. At some points, global sea level climbed several centimetres in a single year. At others it steadied, paused, then crept upward again. Over those millennia, shorelines moved like slow, relentless tides written across generations instead of days. A village built in what felt like a safe distance from the waves might, in the span of a few lifetimes, find the beach creeping inland. Fields salting over, freshwater springs turning brackish. A favourite shell-gathering bar vanished. A fishing ground altered, a burial place claimed by the tide. For us, with satellite maps and global models, it is easy to talk about post-ice age sea level rise as one continuous curve. For them, it would have been felt as a pattern of local retreats. A track of stories, the old camp is underwater now. Your grandfather's path to the reef no longer exists. We used to cross there, now there is only sea. And this has a quiet but profound consequence for archaeology. If humans, like almost every other animal, are drawn to coasts, to the interface of land and sea where food is abundant, trade routes are simple, and climate is moderate, then many of the most attractive settling places over the last 50,000 years now lie underwater. We dig Göbekli Tepe on a dry hilltop. We slice into the mound at Jericho. We uncover houses at Çatalhöyük. But the contemporaries of those inland communities who chose the shore, their fire pits, their middens, their simple harbours, and fish processing camps may sit today beneath tens of metres of water, beneath layers of mud, beneath shifting sand waves on the seafloor. That doesn't mean they are gone beyond reach. It just means that finding them is much harder. Underwater archaeology is, at heart, regular archaeology carried into an alien environment. Instead of walking survey lines across a field, divers or remote-operated vehicles move along transects in dim water. Instead of aerial photographs from planes, we use sonar to paint the seafloor with sound, looking for subtle rises and regular shapes. Side-scan sonar traces outlines, multi-beam sonar gives topography, sub-bottom profilers peer, a little way into buried sediments, searching for right angles where geology alone prefers curves. When something promising appears, a linear ridge where there should be none, a scatter of anomalously shaped stones, a dense pile of broken pottery, divers go down. They fan away silt with their hands or with gentle water jets, expose layers, record the position of each find with boards and tags instead of notebooks. In shallow, clear water, this can almost feel like terrestrial excavation with a veil over it. In deeper, darker locations, it is more like working by touch and instrument, trusting measurements more than eyes. The techniques can reveal astonishing things. They have found Mesolithic camps on what used to be the dry plains of Doggerland in the North Sea, now submerged between Britain and the continent. They have revealed Neolithic wells and trackways off the German and Danish coasts. In the eastern Mediterranean, they have traced ancient harbours with their quays and breakwaters now drowned by a few metres of water and centuries of subsidence. But there are limits. Organic materials, wood, textiles, baskets, leather, may preserve beautifully in anoxic mud, or they may vanish entirely depending on local conditions. Fine-grained evidence of daily life, like post holes in soft coastal sand, can be erased by currents long before anyone reaches them. Even when structural remains survive, assigning precise dates without a generous sample of charcoal, bone, or datable artifacts can be difficult. Most importantly, the underwater record is patchy because our explorations are patchy. We have not systematically mapped every continental shelf. We have not probed every drowned river valley or paleo-delta. Survey tends to follow modern shipping lanes, energy projects and ports, leaving vast stretches of seafloor essentially unknown at archaeological scales. Between what probably existed and what we have actually seen there is a wide, hazy gap. In that gap, imagination grows. We know that lower sea levels created broad, habitable platforms at the mouths of rivers, deltas and estuaries now submerged. We can reconstruct lost coastlines where rivers like the Nile, Euphrates, Indus and Yangtze once flowed farther out before meeting the sea. We can model ancient plains on the continental shelves, relatively flat lands with fresh water, game, and access to marine resources. It is reasonable to think that people lived there. It is reasonable to think that some of them built more than tents or simple huts. Perhaps early villages lined now drowned riverbanks, built of timber and earth that left only ghost traces in the seabed. Perhaps there were simple harbours, stone-lined landings, mooring points, breakwaters of boulders, built by communities already moving goods along the coast before anyone inland had thought to raise a tower like Jericho's. In sheltered bays you might imagine platforms and causeways leading out to deeper water, places where boats were tied up, nets dried, offerings tossed to spirits of the sea. Over centuries, as water crept higher, those installations might have been extended, modified, then finally abandoned as the shoreline marched inland. All of this is plausible. None of it, yet, can be drawn in sharp lines. And that is where missing evidence becomes a kind of Rorschach test. For some, the drowned shelves are a canvas for very elaborate stories, vanished, global civilizations with cities of stone and metal, wiped away by rising seas so thoroughly that almost nothing remains. The fact that underwater archaeology is difficult and incomplete becomes, in those narratives, a positive proof. We haven't found it because we haven't looked in the right place, becomes we haven't found it because it's being hidden or because it was so advanced it left no trace we can recognize. The real picture is more modest and, in some ways, more haunting. We have clear indications that coasts hosted dense, complex lifeways long before what we usually call civilization. Shell middens that stretch for hundreds of meters, fish weirs and traps carefully built of stone, hints of repeated occupation on now submerged terraces. We have the physical fact of rising seas and sinking shorelines, enough to erase many of the more fragile and perishable works of human hands. We have technologies that can, in limited and expensive ways, find pieces of that lost world. And we have huge blank spaces on the map where anything from a few scattered campsites to significant, long-lived settlements might lie, unrecorded. What we do not yet have is evidence for walled coastal cities or continent-spanning maritime empires from the deep past. The lack of such evidence does not prove they never existed, but it also does not justify assuming that they did. In this twilight between known sites and hypothesized ones, submergence offers a different model of disappearance. Not the fiery sack of a city, not a sudden volcanic burial, but a gradual retreat. A shoreline network frays as families move upslope. Harbour installations are repurposed, then left behind. Cemeteries on rising coasts are relocated, their older graves forgotten, as waves reclaim the headland. Within a few centuries, what had been the centre of a community's world is simply out there, under the water, marked only by a line on the horizon, and a cluster of stories about ancestors who used to live where the sea is now. From an archaeological standpoint, that looks like a gap, a missing chapter, a silence between inland tells and the modern coast. From a human standpoint, it is a slow vanishing, so gradual that no one generation feels the full loss, yet total enough that, 10,000 years later, we may never fully reconstruct what was there. When we speak of a civilization before Egypt, it is worth holding this in mind. Some parts of that earlier human story may be literally out of reach, lying beneath silt and seawater. Their absence is not evidence of grandeur, and it is not simple proof of emptiness. It is a reminder that the archive of the earth is incomplete, especially along the edges where land and water trade places. Inland we follow rivers like the Euphrates and Tigris, where floods build up tells instead of erasing them. Along those banks, another line of the story begins to emerge, the slow shaping of fields, canals, and, eventually, the first experiments with writing. Follow those inland rivers north and west in your mind, away from the Nile and Mesopotamia, up through Anatolia where Göbekli Tepe stands, and you reach another basin with a complicated history of water and land, the Black Sea. Today it is a deep, almost landlocked sea, connected to the Mediterranean only by the narrow straits at Istanbul and the Dardanelles. But in the late 20th century, a bold idea took shape among a pair of marine geologists, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, that this quiet inland sea might once have been the stage for a catastrophe, big enough to shake regional populations and echo in memory for thousands of years. Their proposal, which came to be known as the Black Sea Flood Hypothesis, goes like this. At the end of the last ice age, global sea level was far lower, and the connection between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea basin was effectively closed. Rivers from the surrounding mountains flowed into the basin, creating a vast freshwater lake, its surface well below that of the rising Mediterranean to the south. As the ice sheets melted and the world ocean climbed, the Mediterranean crept higher against its rocky boundaries. According to Ryan and Pittman, there came a point around 7,600 to 7,000 years ago, when the waters of the Mediterranean finally overtopped the natural sill at what is now the Bosporus. When that happened, they argued, seawater began pouring northward into the lower Black Sea basin like a broken dam, eating away at the sill, carving the strait, and flooding the freshwater lake with salt water at astonishing speed. They estimated that the shoreline might have retreated kilometres in a matter of months or years. In their reconstruction, coastal plains and river deltas that had been dry, fertile land suddenly went under, drowning any villages, fields, and sacred sites that had been established there during the calmer millennia before. If farmers and fisherfolk were living along that ancient shoreline, and by this date, in the early Neolithic, that seems entirely possible, their world would have shrunk brutally. Homes, wells, ancestral graves, perhaps small shrines. One season they would be there, the next they would be claimed by a vast, rising saltwater body that tasted and smelled unlike anything those communities had known before. To support this vision, Ryan and Pittman pointed to several lines of evidence. Core samples taken from the Black Sea seafloor showed a sharp transition from freshwater to marine mollusk species, with radiocarbon dates clustering around that 7,600 year window. Sediment layers seem to record a sudden change in conditions, not a slow, gradual seep. Submerged river valleys and deltas traced by sonar suggested that the ancient shoreline had indeed been much lower than today's, supporting the idea of a lake that was dramatically filled. Later expeditions, led in part by Robert Ballard, who had found the Titanic, reported what looked like wave-cut terraces and even hints of man-made structures, rectilinear shapes, and what might be foundations about 100 metres below the present sea level along the old shoreline. If those really were human-built, they would be powerful corroboration. People lived there, then the water rose and their settlements went under. Taken together, these clues painted an evocative picture, a relatively sudden, large-scale flooding event, impacting a broad region around the Black Sea at precisely the time when early farming communities were settling, experimenting, and expanding through southeastern Europe and Anatolia. But the hypothesis did not go unchallenged. As more geological and paleo-environmental data accumulated, some researchers argued that the Black Sea's rise was more modest and more spread out over time than the original Great Flood scenario suggested. The rate of inflow from the Mediterranean, they argued, could have been fast in geological terms, but still slow on a human scale, years or decades instead of days or weeks. Enough time, perhaps, for communities to adjust their locations gradually upslope, rather than being wiped away overnight. Others questioned the interpretation of core data. The shift from fresh water to marine species, they noted, could still mark connection to the world ocean without requiring a catastrophic waterfall. The dating uncertainties in the sediments, sometimes spanning centuries, made it hard to pin down exactly how abrupt the transition really was. The supposed man-made structures on the ancient shoreline also came under scrutiny. Natural rock formations, erosional features, and collapsed sediment layers can mimic regular shapes under murky water. Without artifacts that can be securely dated, pottery, tools, clear building materials, most archaeologists remain cautious. Suggestive shapes on sonar are not, by themselves, decisive proof of drowned villages. Even the basic claim that the Black Sea was dramatically lower than the Mediterranean before the connection opened has been debated. Some models suggest a smaller difference in water levels and a more gentle equalization, more like a plugged bathtub slowly leaking than a dam shattering. So where does that leave us? Some version of a rising Black Sea in the early Holocene is widely accepted. The basin did transition from a more isolated, freshwater-dominated lake to a fully marine sea. Shorelines did move. Coastal plains were inundated. The questions revolve around scale and speed. Was it a sharp regional disaster, a flood in the human sense? Or was it one chapter in the longer, uneven story of post-Ice Age sea level rise? Even a moderate version, though, is enough to matter for people living there. If you imagine a band of early farmers on the north shore of that freshwater lake, planting cereals, herding animals, fishing in rivers that emptied into the basin, you do not need a wall of water to disrupt their world. A persistent decadal rise in water level could push them inland repeatedly, forcing relocations, compressing populations into narrower belts of land, and driving some groups to leave entirely, seeking safer ground in the Balkans, Anatolia, or beyond. In this way, a regional catastrophe, sudden or stretched over a generation, could reshape migration. Displaced communities do not just move, they carry ideas, crops, and stories with them. Farming techniques tested on drowned plains might find new homes in upland valleys. Sacred places lost beneath the water might be reimagined as powerful invisible realms beneath the waves. And in the telling, over centuries, what had been a series of encroachments could harden into a single memorable event, the time when the sea came in and did not go back. This is where the geological story brushes against myth. Across the broader Near East and surrounding regions, flood narratives are common. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh preserves an account of a great inundation and a man warned in advance to build a boat. The later biblical story of Noah echoes many of the same motifs. In Greek traditions, there is Deucalion's flood. Farther afield, other cultures preserve memories of waters rising and lands vanishing. It is tempting to link all of these to one specific event, to say, this story is about the Black Sea, or that one about some particular glacial lake breach. But the evidence does not allow such neat assignment. Floods are a universal human experience. Every major river bursts its banks now and then. Storm surges, tsunamis, and dam breaks leave vivid scars. Farmers and fishers everywhere know the fear of waters that do not stop at their usual marks. What the Black Sea hypothesis does usefully highlight is that, in a world of shifting shorelines, some floods are not just local affairs. A rising basin at the edge of Europe, filling with salt water, could have sent waves of migrants into new lands, seeding the same basic memory, Our old home is under the sea, into many different descendant communities. Over generations, as those communities split, travel and tell their histories in new languages, the original geography blurs. The name of the drowned shore is forgotten. The specific sequence of events is smoothed into archetype. A time of wickedness or forgetfulness, a warning from gods or spirits, a chosen family or hero who survives on a vessel or high ground, and a new beginning when the waters recede. Geology can say that the Black Sea rose and changed. Archaeology can, in fragments, show us when people lived along its margins, and when they did not. Genetics can trace movements of early farmers through southeastern Europe that might in part reflect such displacements. But none of these can climb into the stories themselves and label them with exact coordinates. So the Black Sea flood hypothesis sits in an interesting middle ground. It is not a proven script for a single, legendary deluge that explains all myths. It is not, on current evidence, a demonstration of a lost, advanced civilization built in stone around the old freshwater shores. It is instead a plausible example of how regional environmental change, significant, frightening, but still within the range of natural post-glacial processes, could amplify human movement, disrupt early farming societies, and contribute to a deep, persistent cultural theme that water can take the land away. When we talk about a civilization before Egypt, and about worlds that vanished, this is the scale we are on firmer ground with. Not continent-spanning empires erased without trace, but networks of villages, small-scale societies, and early farmers caught in the push and pull of changing climates and restless seas. From the Black Sea's shifting shoreline, we can turn back again toward the river plains, where another experiment was unfolding. While coasts drowned and reformed, some communities were doubling down on staying put, shaping water rather than simply fleeing it, carving channels and fields in the mud. In the land between the rivers, that approach would lead eventually to something new, the first cities with names we still remember. Follow that thought into the lowlands of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates spread their fingers into marshes and shifting channels. Here, around 6000 to 4000 BCE, people were trying a different answer to the problem of unstable water. Instead of chasing it, they tried to pin it down. The earliest farmers in this region did not wake up one morning and decide to build cities. They lived in villages not so different in scale from those of Anatolia or along the Black Sea. Places like Eridu and Uruk began as clusters of houses on slightly raised ground, near dependable water and good alluvial soil. Over generations, irrigation ditches were dug, repaired, extended. Canals linked fields, low levees held back seasonal floods just enough to make the silt work for them instead of against them. As these systems became more elaborate, something else grew with them: obligations. If you have one family managing a small garden, there is little to track. Seeds in, harvest out. But if you have dozens of households feeding water into shared canals, clearing silt together, rotating fields, and storing surplus grain in communal buildings, you suddenly need rules. Who gets water on which day? Who contributes how much labour? Who owes a share of barley to the temple or the local big man in exchange for protection, ritual, or access to land? For a while, memory and gossip can do the work. Elders remember who helped last year. People talk about who is generous and who is stingy. But as villages fuse, as trade caravans start arriving from distant regions with timber, stone, metals, and as surplus grain and wool and fish start piling up, oral bookkeeping starts to fray. This is where those small, humble objects, clay tokens, enter the story. Long before anyone scratched a word onto a tablet, people in the ancient Near East were shaping tiny bits of clay into standardized forms: small cones, spheres, discs, tetrahedrons. Each kind of token seems to have represented a specific unit of something that mattered: a jar of oil, a measure of grain, a head of livestock, a day of labour owed. When a transaction took place, Say a herder delivered 10 sheep to the temple, 10 corresponding tokens could be handed over in return, a clay shadow of the deal. When grain went into a storeroom, the tokens that matched its volume changed hands. They were, in a sense, three-dimensional numbers. As economic and ritual life thickened, another refinement appeared. Instead of loose tokens, people began sealing them inside hollow clay envelopes called bullae. The tokens went in, the envelope was closed, and the outside was stamped with a cylinder seal, or impressed with marks to show the parties involved. If anyone questioned the record, how many sheep were promised, how many jars of oil were stored, one could, in principle, break the bulla open and count. At some point, perhaps out of impatience with all that breaking and counting, someone pressed the tokens themselves onto the wet outer surface before sealing them inside. Now the impressions on the outside matched the number and type of tokens hidden within. The clay envelope became both container and record. From there, the next step seems obvious in hindsight. If the impressions on the outside already told the story, why bother with the tokens inside at all? Gradually, the tokens vanished. The impressions remained. Flat tablets of clay, covered in little wedge-like marks, took over from hollow bullae. At first, these impressions were essentially pictures of tokens. Each sign stood for an object or a number. This is proto-writing still tightly bound to accounting. This long, quiet evolution, the shift from physical counters to impressions to abstract signs, is one of the clearest examples we have of how writing did not fall from the sky as a gift of gods or a brilliant invention of a single genius. It crept in sideways through the back door of bureaucracy, and it did so in a world that was already a few steps down the path toward urban life. By the late 4th millennium BCE, the city of Uruk had grown into something genuinely new. Tens of thousands of people, monumental temples, workshops dedicated to textiles, pottery and metalwork, and a constant flow of goods in and out of storage. The village networks that had crisscrossed the region for millennia were now feeding into a handful of large centres. Travellers from smaller settlements might arrive at Uruk and feel as if they had entered another kind of world. Ziggurats rising above the plain, storehouses stacked with grain collected as tax or tithe, scribes, or the early version of them, sitting with damp tablets marking deliveries and rations. But even here, in one of the earliest true cities, almost everything we see has deep roots. The crops being harvested, wheat, barley, pulses, had been domesticated long before in older villages of the Fertile Crescent. The idea of communal storage, of sharing out rations, of central shrines as both sacred and economic hubs, can be traced back to much smaller Neolithic communities. The trade routes bringing in lapis from Afghanistan, timber from the Zagros, copper from Anatolia, did not spontaneously appear with cities. They built on prehistoric exchange networks that had been tested and expanded for thousands of years. Sumer, in this sense, is less a sudden first civilization than a knot where many older threads finally tighten. Irrigation know-how, village cooperation, long-distance trade, ritual authority, and the slow refinement of accounting systems all converge, and under the pressure of dense populations and complex economies, they crystallize into cuneiform city walls, kings with names, and histories carved into stone. This is where the phrase before Egypt needs a little care. On a timeline, some of the earliest proto-cuneiform tablets at Uruk are indeed slightly older than the first hieroglyphic inscriptions we see along the Nile. Some Sumerian cities reach recognizable urban scale a bit earlier than their Egyptian counterparts. In that simple chronological sense, yes, parts of Mesopotamian urban culture and writing are older than Egypt, but before can also carry another implication, that one civilization stands as a parent and the other as a child, that Egypt must have learned writing from Sumer, or taken its city blueprint ready-made from the land between the rivers. The evidence does not really support that neat storyline. Egyptian hieroglyphs appear quickly, around the time of the first unified kings, already sophisticated and visually distinct from Mesopotamian signs. There are hints of contact between the two regions, Mesopotamian-style cylinder seals and motifs showing up in early Egyptian contexts, for example, but not a clear trail of direct copying. It seems more likely that both regions, facing similar pressures of administration, storage, and display of power, arrived at writing independently, each building on much older habits of counting, marking, and remembering. More broadly, when we look across the Near East, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Nile Valley, and even toward the Indus, a pattern emerges that undercuts the idea of a single lost parent civilization, some vanished Atlantis or primordial empire that gave cities and scripts to everyone else. What we see instead is a landscape of many experiments, small farming villages turning slowly into larger towns, trade routes thickening, local elites using ritual, feasting, and control of storage to build influence, accounting systems evolving from tokens to marks, iconography and symbols becoming more elaborate in different regions, each with its own style. Mesopotamia is one strong example of how that gradual accumulation can look when it runs long enough in one place. You can walk the sequence in the archaeological layers, from simple houses to clustered villages, to small temples with attached storage, to enormous temple complexes managing fields, to full-fledged palaces and bureaucracies. At each step there are continuities and innovations, but no sharp line where civilization simply appears. When we whisper about a civilization before Egypt, this is the scale of mystery that the ground actually gives us. Not a vanished global ancestor, but a dense, muddy history of people learning, step by step, how to live together in larger and larger groups, and how to keep track of the promises they made to each other. From the clay tablets of Uruk and the canal-cut plains of Sumer, the story bends west again, to a different river valley where another experiment was just beginning to crystallize. Along the Nile, long before pyramids, farmers and chiefs were weaving their own path from village life towards something we would one day call a kingdom. Begin upriver, in the long green ribbon that cuts through the desert. The Nile in the 4th millennium BCE was not just a river, it was a machine that ran on the seasons. Each year, snow and rain far to the south swelled its headwaters. Months later, the flood arrived in Egypt, slow and brown, creeping over the banks, filling basins, soaking the low fields. When the waters receded, they left behind a thin skin of dark, mineral-rich silt. On that narrow strip, flanked by lifeless sand and stone, almost anything planted would grow. For people used to the brutal swings of rainfall on open plains, this must have felt almost like a contract with the world. The flood was not perfectly predictable, but it was regular enough. There was a rhythm: inundation, planting, growth, harvest, lean months, and then the water rising again. If you knew the pattern, if you built your villages just high enough, if you dug small canals and basins to hold the overflows, the Nile would reward you year after year. This ecological stability is one of the quiet secrets behind Egypt's long story. Where other regions saw fields fail for years at a time, the Nile corridor, for much of the late prehistoric and early historic period, remained a kind of green metronome. That dependable pulse encouraged people to stay put, to invest in fields and granaries and graves, knowing their children and grandchildren might occupy the same bend in the river. When archaeologists talk about pre-dynastic Egypt, they are talking about the thousands of years when that investment slowly thickened, long before any king wore a white or red crown. In the far south, in what is now Upper Egypt, groups we label with modern names, the Badarian, the Nokkada cultures, left traces of this slow transformation. At first we see small farming villages hugging the edges of the floodplain, mixing cereal agriculture with herding and fishing, simple pit burials with a few pots and personal items, suggest a world still close to its Neolithic roots. Over time, the graves change. Pottery becomes more refined, with distinctive red and black finishes, polished surfaces, intricate painted motifs. We start seeing cosmetic palettes shaped like shields and animals, carved in stone harder to work than ordinary tools required. Copper appears at first in small ornaments and tools. Some graves grow notably richer than others, with multiple vessels, jewellery, and imported goods. In a few cemeteries, one cluster of tombs looks markedly more elaborate than the rest, hinting at families or lineages pulling ahead in status. Settlements follow a similar arc. Villages in Upper Egypt begin to show larger communal buildings, storage areas, craft specialization. In the north, in the delta, sites associated with what scholars call the Mahdi culture start to look like busy trading stations. Mud brick houses, storage pits, evidence of animal traction and carts, and a toolkit that feels tuned to exchange as much as to farming. None of these people called themselves Badarian or Nakada. These are labels we use to make sense of gradual shifts in pottery style, burial habit, and tool types over centuries. But when you line up those changes, a pattern of growing complexity emerges. Hierarchies of wealth, distinct regional styles along the river, increasing control over surplus food, over prestige goods, over the symbols carved and painted on personal items. Those prestige goods tell us something else important. The Nile was never a closed world. In pre-dynastic graves, especially in the south, archaeologists find materials that do not belong to the Nile Valley at all. Lapis lazuli from as far as Afghanistan is rare, but present in slightly later periods. Earlier, we already see obsidian and high-quality flint that likely came through long chains of exchange from the Red Sea hills and beyond. From Nubia to the south, there is evidence of ivory, incense, exotic animal products. To the northeast, across Sinai and into the Levant, we find Egyptian-made jars showing up in early Canaanite sites, while Levantine pottery and ideas drift the other way. The Mahdi culture in the north seems especially plugged into this web. Their settlements sit near routes that lead toward the Sinai copper mines and the Levantine coast. Donkeys, already domesticated, helped move goods along these paths. To the east, small harbours on the Red Sea coast hint at even earlier use of seaways that would later carry expeditions to Punt and beyond. Even if direct sea voyages were rare in the pre-dynastic period, the flow of shells, stones and resins suggests an awareness of that coastal world. This is what it means to say that Egypt was part of a larger interconnected network. Before pyramids, before hieroglyphs on temple walls, people along the Nile were already entangled in trade circuits that stitched together Africa, the Near East, and the Red Sea shores. Ideas as well as objects were moving, ways of building with mud brick, decorative motifs, perhaps stories about distant mountains and strange animals. Then, in the archaeological record, something seems to happen very fast. Around 3200, 3000 BCE, we start to see large fortified settlements in Upper Egypt, like Hierakonpolis and Abydos, with elite cemeteries whose tombs are essentially small underground palaces. The first clear kingly names appear, scrawled in early hieroglyphic-like signs on tags and pottery associated with the so-called Scorpion and Nama kings. A few centuries later, the country appears under a single ruler, with royal tombs in Abydos, standardized iconography of kings smiting enemies, and a bureaucratic apparatus that looks fully formed. From the perspective of written history, Egypt seems to leap from scattered villages to unified kingdom in an instant. One moment, Nakada pottery and village chiefs. The next, dynasties. But that apparent leap says as much about the gaps in our evidence as it does about the speed of change. Most of what survives well in Egypt is stone, baked clay, and the contents of dry graves. The living villages of the delta, built largely in mud brick on low wet ground, have been eroded, flooded, built over, or dissolved back into the fields many times. Even along the upper Nile, settlements often sat in zones later eaten away by the river's shifting course. Elite tombs on higher, drier ground and durable ceremonial objects have a far better chance of surviving than the more modest traces of everyday life and gradual political consolidation. So when the first named kings of a unified Egypt stride into view, they drag with them a long invisible tail of smaller chiefs, local confederations, and perhaps several centuries of conflict and alliance building that left only faint archaeological shadows. Unification looks abrupt because our sampling of the earlier steps is thin. Seen this way, Egypt's emergence is less an isolated miracle and more another knot in the same regional tapestry that included Sumer, the Levant, Anatolia, and the highlands to the east. A river valley with its own ecology and tempo, yes, but still plugged into a world of traders, herders, miners, sailors, and storytellers, while villages along the Nile were figuring out how to ride the annual flood. Something equally important was happening beyond the valley walls, out in a landscape that today we think of as almost entirely barren. To understand why Egypt's rise is only part of a much wider story, you have to step away from the river and walk into what was, for a time, one of the most unexpected green spaces on Earth. Today, if you stand on a dune west of the Nile and look out, you see a horizon of sand and stone, wind, glare, a silence so deep it feels almost hostile. But wind the clock back 10,000 years or so into what climatologists call the African humid period, and that view changes almost beyond recognition. The Great Desert was not a single ocean of sand. It was a patchwork of grasslands, shrublands, lakes, and marshy basins. Seasonal rivers, waters that now look like dry scars, carried water for part of the year. Shallow lakes filled broad depressions. In some places there were permanent bodies of water big enough to be called mega-lakes, ringed with reeds and trees. The air would have been full of sound. Frogs in the shallows. Birds hunting insects over the water. Herds of wild cattle browsing on the floodplains. Gazelle, antelope, maybe even hippos and crocodiles in the deeper channels. Lions, hyenas, and other predators following the herds. Into this Green Sahara walked people. We meet them not through cities or writing, but through quieter traces, hearths, stone tools, and, most evocatively, art. On rock faces and the sheltered walls of shallow caves from Libya to Niger to Sudan, there are scenes painted and pecked into stone, elegant cattle with long, curved horns, herders holding ropes or staffs, small boats, people swimming, hunting parties surrounding giraffes or elephants. When you look closely, these images do not feel like random doodles. They suggest a way of life centered on movement and animals, groups who knew where the water would stand longest after the rains, people who could read the landscape for signs of new grass, who understood how to keep herds alive through dry spells. Archaeologists often call them pastoralists, people whose lives are tied to domesticated animals, especially cattle, sheep and goats. Unlike farmers locked to a single field, pastoralists follow the seasons. When ponds shrink and grazing thins in one region, they move to another. Camps are light, flexible. Houses may be tents, brush shelters, or huts designed to be abandoned without regret. In a Green Sahara, this mobility was a strength. It allowed families to string together a chain of temporary homes across hundreds of kilometers, revisiting favored spots year after year. An old lake shore might hold a scatter of stone tools, broken pots, and animal bones layered over centuries. Then, as the shoreline retreated with a slight shift in climate, the camp would shift with it, leaving behind only a faint archaeology of fire pits and discarded flakes. This world of moving herds and seasonal camps likely formed a broad corridor between West Africa, the Central Sahara, and the Nile Valley, routes threaded through low passes and alongside lake basins. People would have met at watering points, exchanged stories, spouses and goods, stone from distant quarries, shells from coasts never seen, perhaps even rumours of the river far to the east that never quite ran dry. But this corridor was not permanent. The African humid period was just that, a period, driven by slow shifts in Earth's orbit and the dance of monsoon systems. The rains that had once pushed far north began to retreat. It did not happen in a single generation, and it did not happen everywhere at once. Some regions dried earlier, others later. Some years the rains would return with force, raising false hopes. Other years they failed almost completely. Over centuries the lakes shrank. Marshes turned to dusty pans. Grasses gave way to scrub, then to bare soil. Dunes marched across old shorelines. What had been a patchwork of green islands in a semi-arid sea slowly faded toward the desert we know now. For the people living through this, it would not have felt like the Sahara becoming the Sahara. It would have felt like an increasingly anxious search for reliability. Wells that had been deep but dependable starting to come up dry. Places once good for late-season grazing turning barren more often than not. Journeys between water points stretching longer each decade. When you live this way, light on the land, always prepared to move, the obvious response to long-term drying is to shift your world. Some groups likely followed the shrinking green belts south, toward what we now call the Sahel, the broad band of grass and savanna south of the desert. There, even as the Sahara dried, the monsoon rains still fell more reliably. Others are thought to have turned east, funneled by topography and memory toward the Nile, where water still rose and fell each year, buffered by faraway rains. This does not mean that whole peoples simply vanished. It means their descendants show up under different labels, as early Nilotic communities along the river, as herders and farmers in the Sahel, as threads in the genetic tapestry of later African populations. Climate pushed and human groups bent rather than broke. From the perspective of archaeology, though, this kind of bending can look like disappearance. Mobile pastoralist camps leave far less durable evidence than permanent villages. Lightweight structures rot or blow away. Hearths erode. Stone tools and pottery are left in open-air sites that can be stripped by wind, buried by sand, or drowned and then silted over as lake levels fluctuate. When desertification advances, dunes can cover whole landscapes meters deep. What was once a busy lakeside encampment may now be under a featureless expanse of sand with no obvious surface hint of what lies below. Routes vanish even more easily. A path is, at heart, just repeated footsteps, perhaps a slight smoothing of rock, a line of campsites visited and revisited. Once the waterholes along it dry, there is no reason to walk that way. In 1,000 years the track is gone. In 10,000, even the memory of its logic has disappeared. This is one way entire chapters of human movement can slip from the record. No monumental walls to crumble, no baked clay tablets to break, just a continent slowly changing its clothes from green to brown. When we look at the rise of pre-dynastic Egypt, with its concentration of people along the Nile, it is tempting to see only internal dynamics, the river's reliability, the slow build-up of power along its banks. But in the background, the Green Sahara was closing, gently but firmly, like a door. Each generation that found it harder to keep herds alive out on the drying plains had another reason to try life closer to the river or deeper into the Sahelian belt. So when we ask whether a mysterious civilization vanished before Egypt, the Green Sahara reminds us to be cautious about what vanished really means. Whole ways of life tied to lakes that no longer exist did end. Seasonal meeting places, rock art galleries, and sacred hills lost their centrality as water retreated. From a distance of thousands of years that can look like a people disappearing. Up close it is often something more familiar. Climate-driven relocation, gradual merging, the folding of one tradition into another. A herding group that once wandered between three lakes now spends more and more time near the Nile floodplains. Their grandchildren think of themselves as river people. Their rock art is left behind on drying cliffs, waiting to be rediscovered and puzzled over. In that sense, the Green Sahara did not produce a single lost civilization so much as a shifting constellation of mobile societies, some of which may well be ancestral to the very farmers and chiefs who later built Egypt. Their vanishing was not a rupture but a change in address, written in climate and carried in memory. And this pattern, climate closing doors in one region, opening others elsewhere, pushing people to move, mix and reinvent themselves, turns out to be one of the main ways civilizations slip in and out of our view. When people talk about lost civilizations, they often imagine something very specific, a great city, thriving and confident, that one day suffers a catastrophe and simply stops. A sharp edge. One moment there are palaces and plazas, the next there is jungle or sand. Sometimes something like that does happen, but most of the time history is less theatrical and more gradual. Civilizations don't usually vanish like a light switching off. They tend to do three things: collapse, transform, or get folded into something new. Collapse is the dramatic one. It's when a society's institutions and population shrink so severely that its cities are abandoned, its monuments left to crumble. Think of the Western Roman Empire, at one point a vast network of roads, taxes, armies and officials tied together Britain, Gaul, Italy and North Africa. A few centuries later, many of those cities had shrunk to fortified hilltops. Long-distance trade was a shadow of what it had been. Literacy retreated into monasteries, but even there, collapse is not a clean break. The people didn't disappear. Latin evolved into French, Spanish, Italian. Roman laws and customs seeped into the kingdoms that replaced the empire. From close up, collapse is usually a reorganization under stress, with fewer people and simpler structures. Transformation is quieter. It's what happens when a way of life shifts so deeply that later archaeologists give it a new name, even though the change felt continuous to those living through it. The shift from small Neolithic villages in Mesopotamia to the first cities of Uruk is like this. Over many generations, houses clustered closer, temples grew, bureaucracy thickened. No single day marks the start of urban life. A farmer's grandchild might still be planting barley in a field, but now the grain is taxed, measured with standardized weights recorded on clay. Cultural succession is subtler still. A new language, new elite, or new religion appears in the same landscape, standing on older foundations. The Hittites in Anatolia build their capital atop older settlements. Greek cities are founded near Bronze Age sites. In Egypt itself, dynasties rise and fall, but the Nile keeps flooding, and farmers keep planting in the same old mud. To us, looking back through scattered ruins and carbon dates, these different processes can all blur into the same illusion. Something was there, and then less evidence. Part of the problem is simple physics and chemistry. Archaeologists call it taphonomy, the study of what happens to things after they're left behind. Stone and fired clay survive well. That's why we have hand axes from 1 million years ago, and pottery shards from early farmers. But wood, textiles, leather and plant fibre, these are the first to go. A wooden house, a reed boat, a linen banner, a library of papyrus scrolls, all can vanish in a single humid millennium, leaving almost no trace. If your civilization builds in timber instead of stone, or uses earth walls that are slowly ploughed back into the ground, its cities can melt into the landscape until they're just faint discolorations in the soil. If your wealth is stored in cloth, carved wood and food, rather than in metal and baked clay, future archaeologists may have almost nothing to grab onto. Coastlines are even more elusive. The last ice age ended, sea levels rose, and with them thousands of kilometres of ancient shorelines drowned. Many of the places that would naturally attract early dense settlements, river mouths, sheltered bays, rich estuaries, now lie tens of metres underwater. Any harbours, fish traps, piers or villages that once lined those coasts are hidden beneath layers of silt and sand. So a society that preferred wood, reed, and that loved the sea could have been very real, very complex, and now be almost invisible, simply because it built in the wrong materials, in the wrong places for long-term preservation. Language adds another layer of camouflage. When a dominant tongue spreads through migration, conquest, trade, or prestige, it can sweep across a region in a few centuries. The people speaking it may be mostly the same people who were there before, but to us they suddenly look new. Farmers in the Nile Valley, for instance, may carry genetic threads from Green Sahara pastoralists, hunter-gatherers from the eastern deserts, and older local communities. But if an Afro-Asiatic language variety becomes the prestige speech, and old traditions are retold in new words, the continuity of population can be hidden behind a change in vocabulary. We see this in many parts of the world. The Celtic languages in Western Europe, then Latin, then Romance languages. Each wave creates the illusion of a fresh start. Underneath, the descendants of Iron Age villagers keep tending fields, worshipping at some of the same springs and hills, even if the names they use for them are different. This is why historians talk about Dark Ages with some caution. The phrase does not mean nothing was happening. It usually means our sources thin out. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, written documents became rarer. From our perspective, the lights dim between roughly the 5th and 8th centuries in many regions. But archaeology shows continued farming, new pottery styles, new burial customs, small kingships forming and dissolving. A Dark Age is more like walking into a room with fewer candles, not an empty room. The same can happen much earlier. We see a flourishing Bronze Age culture, then centuries where there are fewer monumental buildings, fewer inscriptions, less durable material. The temptation is to imagine a lost civilization that rose and fell in the gap. Sometimes there really were complex societies we've barely sampled. Often, though, the gap is in our evidence, not in human activity. So, when we hear dramatic claims of civilizations more advanced than Egypt, of global empires erased without a trace, it can help to have a calm checklist in mind. First, what is the hard evidence? Not just stories or coincidences, but datable objects, layers, structures. A single enigmatic artifact is intriguing, but it does not, by itself, require a vanished super-civilization. Second, are there more ordinary explanations? Could climate change, shifting rivers, or sea level rise account for the pattern? Could a known culture have transformed, moved, or been absorbed rather than disappeared? Third, how much of the mystery comes from gaps in our record, missing coastlines, perishable materials, unexcavated regions, rather than from something uniquely strange? Fourth, does the claim depend on assuming that people in the deep past were either primitive or perfect? Real societies are messy. They innovate in some areas, lag in others. A group might master stone architecture but know nothing of writing, or sail long distances with very simple tools. And finally, does the idea connect with what we know from genetics, linguistics, and comparative archaeology? Or does it require that almost all existing evidence be wrong or misleading? Holding these questions gently in mind doesn't drain the wonder from the past. If anything, it makes it richer. It reminds us that civilizations can fade without vanishing, that lineages can continue under new names, and that whole ways of life can be folded into others like rivers joining a wider stream. With that in mind, we can turn to the more speculative edge of our topic, the boldest lost civilization theories, and how to weigh them without either dismissing everything or believing anything. When people imagine a civilization older than Egypt, they often reach for the same picture, even if they don't realize it. A shining city on a vanished coast. White stone buildings may be crystal towers. Wise astronomer priests charting the stars. A global navy of elegant ships. Perfect knowledge, perfect harmony, until a single terrible day when the sea rises or the earth shakes and the whole thing sinks beneath the waves. Atlantis is the prototype, but there are many variations. Lemuria in the Indian Ocean, Mu in the Pacific, Hyperborea in the far north. Sometimes they're tied to real places, like the Black Sea or the Mediterranean. Sometimes they float almost entirely in myth. These stories endure because they do something very human. They explain gaps. They gather scattered puzzles into one satisfying solution. Strange ruins flood myths from many cultures, odd alignments of stones, unexplained maps instead of 100 small, messy stories. You get one big, clean one. They also flatter us. A lost golden age suggests that human potential has already reached heights we can't imagine, and that maybe, just maybe, a few fragments of that ancient wisdom survive, waiting for rediscovery. It makes the world feel deeper, almost enchanted. And there's another, quieter reason they appeal. We know how fragile our own world is. Climate, disease, political chaos, all the forces that have battered earlier societies are still with us. When we tell ourselves stories of great civilizations wiped out overnight, we're also whispering fears about our own. So how do we weigh these ideas without simply rolling our eyes or tumbling headfirst into them? The first step is to be clear about what would count as strong evidence for a civilization that really does push our timeline back in a dramatic way. At the simplest level, archaeologists look for three things: date, context, and pattern. Date means we can actually pin something down in time. Radiocarbon for organic materials. Optically stimulated luminescence for buried sediments. Volcanic ash layers anchored to known eruptions. If someone claims a city is 20,000 years old, but every datable sample from the site clusters around 3,000 years ago, that's a problem. Context means the thing we're looking at sits in a clear archaeological layer with other materials. A stone block on a beach is just a rock until we see it resting in a built wall, on a floor with tools, food, remains, maybe burials, all sealed together by later deposits. The more complete the context, the stronger the case that we're looking at a real community, not a random oddity. Pattern means repetition. One strange artifact could be a hoax, an error, or a misinterpretation. 10 similar artifacts from different sites, all independently dated, all showing the same style or technique, are harder to dismiss. The same goes for settlement patterns. Multiple villages, linked by roads or canals, sharing architectural habits. Civilizations leave fingerprints in many places at once. When those three converge, solid dates, clear contexts, repeatable patterns, our picture of the past can change quite radically. That's how Göbekli Tepe forced archaeologists to rethink what small pre-farming groups were capable of. It wasn't one carved pillar, it was many circles, many stones, many layers, all pointing to the same conclusion. Now, compare that to how many Atlantis-style claims are presented. Often they rest on a handful of anomalies lifted out of their settings. A single underwater structure with straight lines. A carved stone whose style seems out of place. A myth that sounds familiar across cultures. These are then combined into a grand narrative, without the connective tissue that real archaeology leans on. There are some recurring red flags. Cherry-picking is a big one. You'll see impressive-sounding facts lined up in a row, while inconvenient details quietly vanish. The dates that don't fit, the nearby, well-understood sites that offer a mundane explanation. The specialist reports that say natural formation instead of ancient harbour. Missing stratigraphy is another. Stratigraphy is the pattern of layers in the ground. Older under younger, like a slow-motion cake. Real sites have it, even if it's messy. Claims that rely on isolated stones, loose artifacts sold on the market, or objects with no recorded find spot are much harder to evaluate. Without stratigraphy, you're missing the timeline. Then there are objects that conveniently match modern imaginations too closely. An ancient battery shaped like a modern jar. A jet airplane in a relief if you squint and ignore the surrounding context. When an artifact seems to predict modern technology in uncanny detail, it's worth asking, is this genuine, or are we projecting? Has the piece been tested? Do other, similar items exist from the same layer? Outright forgeries do occur, especially when there's money and fame to be made from rewriting history. They often share traits: dramatic claims, poor documentation, resistance to independent testing. A healthy approach is not to shout fake at everything, but to look for openness. Are the creators of the claim willing to share samples, excavation notes, exact locations? Balancing all this is important, because the past really does surprise us. Stonehenge was once dismissed as the work of savages. The sophistication of Maya astronomy was ignored for decades. The idea that Neanderthals buried their dead with care met resistance until the evidence piled up. The first serious proposals of an African origin for modern humans went against the grain before becoming the mainstream view. So a blanket rule of nothing radical is ever true would be as unhelpful as believing every headline. Method, not mood, is what matters. A cautious openness means we allow for the possibility that some future discovery could push organized, monument-building societies back earlier than we currently expect, especially along drowned coasts or in underexplored regions, without assuming in advance that there was a globe-spanning super-civilization with technology rivaling our own. It's worth remembering that complexity comes in many flavors. A network of seafaring villages 10,000 years ago, trading obsidian and shell across hundreds of kilometers, would be astonishing and important, even if they never built skyscraping towers or left behind metal. A valley culture organizing irrigation and seasonal festivals long before Egypt's pyramids would reshape our story of where civilization begins, even if it never turned into an empire. Leaving room for discoveries like that is very different from promising a hidden Atlantis. The truth is, we don't yet have solid, multi-layered, independently confirmed evidence for a vanished global civilization older than Egypt. What we do have are scattered hints of regional complexity, drowned shorelines that invite careful study, and a record that keeps filling in, often in directions no one predicted. As we drift further into this story, it can be calming to hold both ideas at once, that humans in the deep past were fully capable of surprising ingenuity, and that good evidence has to be slow, patient, and repeatable. The mystery isn't an empty space just waiting for a single dramatic answer. It's more like a foggy landscape where new shapes slowly emerge as our tools improve, our methods sharpen, and more soil is gently brushed away. And even without a lost super-civilization, what we already see in that mist is astonishing enough. So where does all of this leave us when we circle back to that idea of a civilization before Egypt? Not a sci-fi Atlantis with glass towers and death rays, but the strongest real candidates for deep, organized complexity. Göbekli Tepe is one. 10,000 years ago and more, people who still lived by hunting and gathering carved multi-ton pillars, hauled them upright, and decorated them with animals and abstract symbols. No pottery, no evidence of permanent fields. Yet there's planning, engineering, and a shared symbolic language etched in stone. It tells us that large, coordinated projects and rich ritual life did not have to wait for cities or kings. Then there's that wider Neolithic web in Anatolia. Villages like Nevellichori and later Catalhouk crowding houses together, sharing similar architectural ideas, passing obsidian and pigments across long distances. No palaces, No written laws, but ongoing cooperation between hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. Rooftop streets, shared ovens, wall paintings that echo from house to house. A tapestry culture, woven from many small threads, rather than one shining capital. To the south, Jericho with its tower and its wall. Maybe not a fortress in the way we imagine, but a startling early experiment in modifying the landscape, drawing a circle around us and keeping the floods and dangers at bay. The first hints that humans could think of a place as collectively theirs, worth fortifying, maintaining, defending together. Along old shorelines, from the Black Sea basin to the now drowned plains of the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean shelves, there are scattered hints of harbours, fish traps, and seasonal camps that would have thrived when sea level was much lower. Nothing yet that looks like a lost global empire, but plenty that suggests dense little worlds of coastal foragers and fishers, living in ways that left only faint fingerprints once the water rose. And then, later, the slow brightening of Sumer and pre-dynastic Egypt. Irrigation channels creeping across alluvial plains. Temples and shrines that started small and grew layer upon layer. Clay tokens turning into tablets. Iconic pharaohs are still far in the future, but the habits that will one day support them, record-keeping, central storage, ritual spectacle, managed labour, are already budding. Taken together, these places show us something more subtle than a single before Egypt civilization. They show repeated attempts at living densely, organising labour, formalising ritual, and transmitting knowledge over time and space. Experiments in complexity, running in parallel, sometimes failing, sometimes feeding into later traditions. So why do so many of these early experiments feel like they vanish? Part of it is simple erosion and time. Mud brick melts. Wood rots. Cloth and leather disappear. If your monumental architecture is timber posts and packed earth, 10,000 years of wind and rain can erase almost everything but the post holes. Part of it is water. Coastlines during the last ice age sat dozens of meters lower than they do now. Any community that loved estuaries, deltas, or shallow bays, a perfectly sensible choice, built its life in a zone that was gradually flooded. Those villages are now under silt and seawater, beyond the reach of casual discovery. Part of it is movement. When climate shifts, rivers change course, or resources are exhausted, people leave. They don't vanish in a puff of mystery. They fold their tents, take their stories, and walk. The next valley, the next basin, the next coastline quietly inherits their skills, their crops, their rituals. In the archaeological record, it can look like a break. On the human level, it's more like a migration or a slow diffusion. And part of it is transformation. A ritual centre like Göbekli Tepe may be deliberately buried when its role is over, its functions absorbed into smaller, more local shrines. A dense village may disperse into hamlets that are harder for us to find. A way of organising labour may stop leaving big stone traces and continue instead as oral rules, seasonal gatherings, kinship ties. What looks to us like disappearance is often continuity in disguise. Because people adapt, they merge, they reinvent. The farmers of early Nile villages become the communities that build the first mastabas, then the first pyramids. The scattered lineages of Upper Mesopotamia feed labour and ideas into the cities of Uruk and Ur. Traders along drowned coasts become the ancestors of inland groups, carrying shells, stories, and remembered roots far from the waves. If you could stand on a hill and watch human history as a time-lapse, you probably wouldn't see neat, discrete civilizations blinking on and off. You'd see streams of people branching, looping, braiding back together, technologies and rituals travelling faster than genes, dialects blending, old myths retold with new names. Egypt is not a sudden beginning. It's a bright knot in a much longer, more tangled thread. What the mystery really leaves us with then is less a single question. Was there a lost civilization before Egypt? And more, a mood, a sense that the ground beneath our feet is saturated with stories we only partly understand, that for every Göbekli Tepe we've uncovered, there may be others still under hillsides, or lying quiet beneath shallow seas, their stones softened, their wood long gone, their memory preserved only as faint patterns in the soil. It invites a kind of gentle humility. Our timelines are the best we can build from what we've found so far. They can and do change. Entire chapters of the human story have come to light within a single lifetime, and there is no reason to think that process is over. As you drift towards sleep, you can let that be a comforting thought instead of an unsettling one. The past is not a closed book. It's a landscape we are still learning to walk through. Every careful excavation, every core drilled from a buried shoreline, every new method of reading ancient DNA or ancient pollen clears a little more of the fog. Somewhere, under silt or sand or forest, there were villages where people watched the same stars you see now, told stories around fires, worried about floods and harvests, wondered about their own ancestors. Their names are gone, but a trace of their choices lives on in the cultures that followed, and in you. If you've enjoyed wandering through that fog with me tonight, you can gently tap like or subscribe so you can find your way back to the channel next time. It helps more than you might think, and if you feel like sharing one small piece of your own story, you're welcome to leave a comment with where you're listening from. A city, a village, a ship at sea, a quiet room late at night. Scattered points of light across a sleeping world, all listening in on the long unfinished story of us.